I first met Dan probably in the mid-90s at a group called the Digital Commerce Society of Boston, when the internet was just started to be used by business, and a group of people in the Boston area were coming together to try to figure out, how can we do business on the internet? What are the risks of doing this? And at the time, I was part of a group called The Loft, and I was way down in the weeds with my disassembler, looking at packets on the network, things like that, and went to the Digital Commerce Society of Boston and met guys like Dan who would get up there and he gave a talk, actually I think it's about 10 years ago this year, called Risk Management. It's Where the Money Is. Is that the right title? So Dan was way up in the stratosphere, thinking about the has always been at that high level, because as you go through your career, you start off knowing something in detail. Dan's background is biostatistics. He has his PhD there from Harvard University, and I think that's back when he was in the weeds. He was doing statistics on health incidents, and over time, I think that learning how to measure those things and looking at how the real world works with things like disease informs us how the internet works. And these are some of the things that Dan has really brought to our thinking. Today he's at, I did work with him at Stake, and today he's at Vertisys, where he works on the data leakage problem, which obviously is a very challenging thing to figure out. So without, hopefully we're rolling now, and take it away, Dan. Great to have you here.
Thank you. I'll actually digress and respond to something he said. Everybody my age in this field came from something else. It was one of the great beauties of this. Not to say that being replaced by people who are trained for it isn't a good thing. It is. But the early stages were, in fact, everybody came from something else. And while there's still a few of us around who do come from something else, I encourage you to learn how statisticians think, or civil engineers, why do bridges fall down, or lawyers, what's the difference between enforcement and policy, or doctors, making life and death decisions without opening you up every time, and so forth. I mean, this is a Renaissance field, and I'll actually come to that. I'm actually going to largely read what I have to say, because I wanted to write it out in a way that would also be a record of this, so you could have it, and the organizers will have it this afternoon. That's out of respect for an audience. That is to say, as far as I'm concerned, if you have enough respect to listen, I should have enough respect to write it down. And I am aware it's being videotaped. Maybe the two of them will go together. So I'll begin. If you were to come in my office, you would see on the wall 4 rules. Work like hell, share all you know, abide by your handshake, and have fun. And I think today's invitation encompasses all 4 of those, and for that reason I thank you for it. My topic for today is the future. In a sense, the future is once and always a topic for any security talk, unless one likes to sit around one-upping each other with war stories. Let me begin with some biases. The first is that security is a means and not an end. Therefore, a talk about the future must necessarily be about affecting the future, which is why security is about risk management, and risk management is about changing the future, not explaining the past. Yes, I'm acutely aware that the farther back you look, the further forward you can see. But that is both different and precisely what I'm now going to try to do. Let me be clear, however, that the only way to judge whether a prediction has any value or not is to wait until it is no longer a prediction. It is likely that some of you will agree, and likelier still that some of you will disagree, that only God could have made a world like the one we inhabit, that its spectacular combination of complexity and durability, balance and terrible beauty can only have come from a designer. At the same time, if we can get at the truth, it won't matter what we believe. Let us put aside for a moment how it is we got here. As I said before, risk managers do not care to explain the past, only to affect the future. Yet by looking back, perhaps we can see ahead. Let us try to split that hair. To look back so that we can see ahead, but without having to settle amongst ourselves the questions of causality. Paleobiologists see evolution as, quote, punctuated equilibria, unquote, which is to say long periods of stability interrupted by short periods of rapid change. Evolution, as they describe it, is not some steady upslope at 8% grade, but rather the unexpected when least expected, and a flurry of change that will eventually damp itself out enough to be called progress, as if anything that brought us to where we are must have been progress, since this is the best world we have yet made. Given that we are not explaining the past, only observing it, we don't have to agree on whether the world was made, but we can surely agree that the world going forward is made, and by us, and we can agree that we are only too eager to make the world we want. In other words, we had better hope that we are intelligent designers ourselves. Put differently, sentient intervention in evolution's progress is just more evolution, but at a faster clock rate. Changes that depend on the favorable alignment of random perturbations takes geologic time. Changes that are designed may have just as many unforeseen consequences, but the equilibria they punctuate are of much shorter duration, often a duration short enough that there's little real stability between episodes of punctuating change. Those who would argue, for example, that capitalism is simply a transfer of Darwinian survival to the synthetic life form known as a corporation, living in a synthetic ecosystem known as the market, would agree, though they would call these intervals between one punctuating event and the next a business cycle. The risk management we need is therefore the ability to maximize the damping effects of stability, and to be prepared to handle the punctuating events of the definitively unpredictable, the latter being what Taleb called black swans. In my career, I've seen enough of these cycles of stability and surprise to find the description apt, even if the cadence of it is arrhythmic. The most challenging security RFP I ever received had 3 bullets. 1, assess us thoroughly. 2, tell us how we compare to our peers. 3, from that point forward, stream us engineering change orders that keep us at constant risk. And despite the brevity and clarity of that, it was simply impossible to meet. This is precisely the so-called innovator's dilemma. Once your firm fully optimizes for stability, that is to say, once you are fully capitalized and the capitalization appears as a barrier of entry to other players, you are then nothing but tasty prey for the next predator who evolves in a flash of unexpected surprise. Can we look back and see a few of these sorts of episodic catharses? Of course we can. Every transformation of the computing world has been a surprise, one that removed the reason for existence of its predecessor depended upon, and which was itself later removed in like manner. The first computers were rare, expensive, and they made redundant legions of people who worked out tables of logarithms to 9 digits by hand. Timeshare destroyed the market for standalone behemoths, and desktop PCs destroyed the market for timeshare. Today it looks as if software as a service is about to destroy the market for desktop PCs. At every stage, the best X ever produced was also the last X ever produced, as it was itself rendered irrelevant by the leading edge of the next phase. My father, who today is for the first time not present on his birthday, had the finest Frieden mechanical desk calculator made. It was even programmable, mechanically programmable, and yet the lousy, truly lousy Bomar brain made mechanical desk calculators irrelevant. I'm sure you can name example after example of the same phenomenon, that of a kind of equilibrium punctuated by the end of the environment on which the most evolved members of that equilibrium, of that environment, depended. This being a talk about the future means that we must examine how this pattern in nature plays itself out against the digital sphere. Note that I said pattern in nature, as that is precisely the mindset I want you to have, that regardless of whether you think of the world as a triumphant creation of some omnipotent God, or, like calculus, the infinite sum of infinitesimal bits from random time series, that the very nature of nature has examples of processes that cannot be other than the kinds of processes we should expect in the digital world. Unless we have become as gods ourselves, some mixture of the unexpected and our adaptations to it will be that of which the future is made. Every invention we make proves either non-viable, which is to say a non-functional mutation within the human ecosystem, or it is viable, which is to say it seizes an hitherto unoccupied niche, either by creating that niche or stealing it from whomever occupies it now. Whether creating or stealing niches does not matter, since over time the number of niches increases. at least until one of those punctuations of the equilibrium occurs. As you know, the rainforests are the oldest biome on Earth, which is to say they've enjoyed the longest run of stability, unlike, say, the boreal forests of Canada, which 10,000 years ago were under a mile of solid ice. As such, rainforests have the greatest number of species, which is to say the greatest number of niches and the most complex interdependencies. 25 acres of Malaysian rainforest will have more species of trees than all of the US and Canada combined. 43 species of ants were found in a single tree in Peru, which is more than in all of the British Isles. The oldest biome in North America, the temperate rainforest of the southern Appalachians, has more species of lungless salamanders than anywhere else on Earth. Yet the equilibrium of the rainforest is being punctuated by a much more recent invasion, namely Homo sapiens with power machinery. Some estimate species diversity in these rainforests is draining away now at the rate of 5 an hour. The important thing to realize here is that to the biome, to the occupier of a niche that was here yesterday and won't be here tomorrow, this change is a surprise. No tree says, time to move. No salamander says, I need to evolve. Evolutionary change depends on this unpredictability. Otherwise, yesterday's winners are also tomorrow's winners, and dominant species just get more dominant. Note that change here is not a synonym for disaster. Some pines have cones that only open after the tree in which they live have been burned down in a forest fire. This kind of opportunism for disaster is something we can see in our world today and every day, and that for every backdoor some worm or virus installs, you can bet your paycheck that there's some other bit of malware that is out searching for the self-same backdoor for its own purposes. A backdoor unused is like a biological niche unoccupied. Nature, both biologic and digital, abhors a vacuum. The backdoor will get used. The only question is by what or by whom. Let's illustrate that specifically. Everyone but everyone defines the 9/11 attack as an out of the nowhere, a black swan, to again use Taleb's terminology. That attack changed everything because it was so unforeseen. It was a physical attack, but we here in the digital world have to deal with digital attacks. Many of us have heard the phrase digital Pearl Harbor, and many of us here wish we hadn't. If we talk to a member of the general public, we are likely to hear something like, look, you miserable paranoid worrywarts, you keep predicting a big problem, and if it was all that likely, it would have happened by now. In fact, every day that goes by without something like that happening makes it less likely that it ever will. Would you just stop bothering me? Now, a statement like that we have gone this far without anything big happening, is precisely the kind of statement that expects stability to continue, and which is necessary but not sufficient for a punctuation of such stability. If we look at 9/11 as a digital security people would, we might remember that the NIMDA virus appeared the evening of September 18, 2001, a week later. Until that point, we'd never seen a virus that carried more than one mechanism of transmission, and NIMDA had 5. So to begin with, even if we'd known everything about each of those 5 methods, including population statistics for the numbers and connectivity of vulnerable hosts, we wouldn't have predicted the ability of NIMDA to move as fast as it did, as we had not thought yet to model the union of multiple vulnerabilities. This, however, is not all. For writers of classic virus attacks, the measure of their success is the energy differential between the first entry to a given target and the second, i.e. the bigger the difference in how hard it is to break in the first time and how easy it is to break in the second time, the bigger the win. And the lowest energy way to maximize that energy differential is to install a backdoor, and of course, therefore, that is exactly what NIMDA did. It installed a new backdoor. Because NIMDA had 5 methods for propagation, and because it was evidently written with speed in mind, NIMDA was also, to that date anyway, the fastest spreading virus we had ever seen. The rate of spread is known amongst infectious people as virulence, and I'll come back to that in a second. As you know, nearly all malware in the wild persists indefinitely. An older virus called E911 was such an example. E911 would cause your modem to dial 911 repeatedly. That is all it did. Now, when I call you on the phone, the circuit stays up until the calling party disconnects. That would be me. When I call 911, however, the circuit stays up until the called party disconnects, and this is a difference that's done at the switch. For the obvious reason that you do not want the intruder to cut the phone line and have the police dispatcher have to say, now whom was I talking to? For the police to hang up on a 911 call when the calling party has gone away requires a human decision done at human timescale under uncertainty. Because of this, it is possible to saturate a 911 console, and that is precisely what E911 is crafted to do, saturate a 911 console. The E911 virus was old and forgotten on September 18, 2001, but it was still available and on the net, and of course the internet in the fall of 2001 was still dominated by dial-up connections. We got lucky in the simplest, stupidest, dumb luck kind of way. No jackass had the imagination to grab the E911 virus and retarget it to the backdoor that NIMDA was busy installing at warp speed everywhere while we were all preoccupied with watching CNN 24/7. If someone had done that, then everyone in America would have gotten up the morning of September 19 only to find that there was no emergency service available nationwide. It would have been turned off everywhere and all at once, like a light switch. While that would have been not have been a disaster of a physical sort, I submit that it would have been a grand mal seizure of the public confidence. Clinically, a grand mal seizure of the public confidence is the definition of terror. It would have required no planning, just opportunistic reaction, and it would have been an unpredictable event whose downstream influence was out of all proportion to its concrete effect. It would parallel the Treasury's position that money lost or banks failed is a private tragedy of no importance, but that public loss of confidence in the financial system must be avoided. On September 18, 2001, we escaped a public loss of confidence by luck and luck alone. As such, the next time someone tells you that the absence of a major internet attack to date makes the absence of one tomorrow more assured, you can remind them that this proof that we escaped such an attack by dumb luck puts to bed any implication that every day without such an attack makes such an attack less likely. It does not make it less likely, but what it does most assuredly do is make it more surprising when it does come. Note that I'm not conjuring up nation-state actors or divine intervention, though I personally believe that both are at work at all times. What I am suggesting is that change is what evolution is about, and that change is rarely steady, but rather tends to be abrupt, that change is event-driven, that the amount of change an event engenders is proportional to the surprise with which the event arrives, and that we cannot make this otherwise. Our preaching on this topic wastes airtime, and which is worse, the more we say it is coming, the more those who live in the moment have reason to ignore us. Speaking as a person with some training in probability, perhaps the point is that probabilistic events occur eventually. Speaking as a person whose faith is real but irrelevant to you, perhaps the point is that everything that has a beginning has an end. For some time now, I've been promoting the idea of measurement in security, arguing that security is now so essential a concern that we can no longer use adjectives and adverbs, but must instead use numbers. If you have heard me speak on this topic, you will know that, consistent with the view that risk management is about changing the future and not explaining the past, I see no need for metrics beyond their role in decision support. At our present skill in measurement of security, we generally have an ordinal scale at best, not an interval scale and certainly not a ratio scale. In plain terms, this means that we can say whether X is better than Y, but how much better and compared to what is not so easy. Having an ordinal scale is nevertheless well and good, as knowing which is better of two alternatives is what decision-making is precisely about. At the same time, Churchill's admonition that the further back one looks, the further forward one can see, implores us to at least test our predictive ability by imagining that we could use the past to test a mechanism of prediction, since in using the past we can actually calibrate a prediction method by actually knowing what eventually happened. A moment ago I used the word virulence. To a physician, virulence is how badly a bacterium makes you cough and sneeze or worse. But to a bacteriologist, virulence is an innate measure of how good your immune system is at killing that bacterium, since if it can kill it with assurance, to survive that bacterium must cause you to pass it on to the next victim, and to do so quickly enough that your immune system does not cut the skein of its life. Better immune response means greater virulence. We can thus test a little hypothesis of prediction. Working with bacteriologist Trudy Wassenaar, I plotted the date of appearance and the speed of transmission for the big-name computer viruses from 1995 on. What we found was just what an evolutionary model would predict. Virus appearances became surprise and progressively rarer, likely due to progressively competent computer immune systems, but when they did appear, each was much, much more virulent than the one before. In other words, the malware called a virus, while perhaps no longer of much interest, showed the pattern of evolution that you would expect in the natural world, only evolving faster in time than random mutation would predict, and thus confirming the view that sentient opponents only make the clock run faster. Virus attacks have, of course, become rarer over time, which is to say that where infectious agents once ruled, today it is parasites. Parasites have no reason to kill their hosts. On the contrary, they want their host to survive well enough to feed the parasite. A parasite will generally not care to be all that visible either. The difference between parasites and symbiotes can be a close call in some settings, and one of the folks here who famously bragged that he could take the internet down in 20 minutes has also said that a computer is better managed once it is in a botnet than before, since the botmaster will be serious about closing the machine up tight against further penetration, and similarly serious about patch management. Therefore, since one can then say that both the machine's nominal owner and the bot master are mutually helped, what we have is evolution from parasite to symbiote in action. According to Margulis and Sagan, life did not take over the globe by combat, but by networking. On that basis and others, botnets are a life form. As most of you know, I've argued for some species diversity in those parts of the computing infrastructure that we care to call essential. Stating the obvious, no one calls their part of the infrastructure inessential, so we might as well talk about it all. The word you're waiting for me to say is monoculture, and there I've said it. The diversity of the natural world is something we agree on far more than we disagree. Preserving it as an end is a near universal desire, and like computer security, all the contention is simply around how, not if. But we, laughably unintelligent designers, prefer monocultures, whether it is dryland wheat or corporate desktops. John Evans at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, observes that when a natural hardwood forest is replaced with pulpwood monoculture, the crop fails in the first rotation because the beetles go from being a native disturbance to a native epidemic. It only gets worse when you increase their food supply. Remember, if you will, that a patch is an advertisement of where the opponent's next meal is coming from, since, as Gerhard Eschelbeck showed, patching behavior is precisely like radioactive decay. In each succeeding interval, half of the then unpatched systems are patched, and in any case, 80% of exploits appear within the first half-life of the patching of the patch-announced vulnerability and wreak 85% of their damage in the first fortnight. As there is not a person in this or any room who will argue for explicitly reducing the species diversity of the natural world as if it were a national or international goal, we have to ask why we do it in the synthetic biomes of enterprise computing. Despite what you might think, I am sympathetic, entirely sympathetic to the actual reason we do it. Making everything almost entirely alike is and remains our only hope for being able to manage it on a consistent manner. Put differently, when you deploy a computing monoculture, you are making a risk management decision that the downside risk of a black swan event is more tolerable than the downside risk of perpetual inconsistency. That is rational to a point. In the physical world, the attacker must commit a perfect crime, and the police have all the time in the world to unravel the mystery. In the digital world, the police must craft the perfect defense, and the attacker has all the time in the world to find a single flaw in that defense. That realization leads to and underpins the demand to have consistent, airtight security. That phrase, consistent and airtight, just about has to mean all alike. And all alike is the perfect setting for attacks to come without warning, though if you're lucky, they don't come on your watch. I got into this monoculture versus diversity kick when I was asked to categorically state what sorts of attacks were of a level that legitimately might be called a national security concern. My answer then and now was that only two kinds of attacks were that important. And like the Treasury Department's view of bank failure, that everything else amounted to nothing more than some set of private tragedies. The first kind is some mechanism that, to operate correctly, must be a single point of function and therefore must be a single point of failure. The red telephone on the president's desk is such a mechanism. Having 23 red telephones would be far worse than having one red telephone. As such, that single red telephone deserves defense in depth, and defense in depth is simply a referendum on your willingness to spend money for multiple layers. It is rarely, if ever, a research-grade problem. The other national security scale concern is cascade failure. And cascade failure is so very much easier when the attacker only has to write one bit of malware, not 10 million. The idea is obvious. Believing in it is easy. Acting on it is evidently rather hard. I note in passing that the population statistics for platforms, operating systems, and tools present amongst you sitting in this room today bear no resemblance to the public at large. And as such, you are here collectively acting on the diversity belief, even if you cannot sell the idea beyond such baby steps as address space location randomization, the existence of which I view as total vindication of the monoculture thesis. What I'm driving at is that the natural world has lessons for us that we are pretty miserable, and that we are pretty miserable at intelligent design, provably poorer at it than whatever process brought nature to us in the state it was in before we began to demolish it. In the natural world, a high presence of attack pressure must and does result in a high rate of mutation. What part of your body suffers the most daily insults and mutates all day, every day? Answer, E. coli in your gut. Their mutation rate rises and falls in reaction to stress, since if things are going well, a mutation is likely to be deleterious, whereas if things are going badly, it may be the last chance. And in any case, reproductive fidelity is more metabolically expensive than producing mutations. I suggest that some doctoral student might take a close look at whether a withering digital attack ought to provoke some adaptive mutation in the target. Put differently, if you are losing a game you cannot afford to lose, change the rules. Social insects are the great success story in the natural world. There are 2 to the 50th ants on this planet. The biomass of ants and termites is 1/3 of all terrestrial animals, and honeybees alone confer more economic benefit to humanity than all other insects combined collectively withdraw. I simply do not have time today to go into all the ways that social insects and armies of computers on networks are alike, so I'll just refer you, if I may, to my paper in ACMQ from last April. One hint, researchers were able to show with honeybees precisely what I said was true for computer monocultures, that a hive, all genetically identical, either wins decisively or loses catastrophically, while a hive with genetic diversity neither wins nor loses in any spectacular fashion at all. In the natural world, a plant that has been eaten alive by, say, aphids will manufacture a come-hither scent that draws ladybugs. If you're a ladybug and you smell that "the aphid diner is now open" aroma, what would you do? Bank tellers may well cooperate with a robber, but you can bet they've pressed the button on the floor that calls the gendarmes. We do this with our honeypots. They allow themselves to be taken down by some thug, all the while snapping pictures for the network police. In a sense, our intrusion detection systems do the same. They call the police while they are possibly going down. Honeypots are, if nothing else, a kind of mimicry. Nature has dozens of kinds of mimicry. To mention just 2, there's Batesian mimicry, where some prey species tries to look like some non-prey species, a sheep in wolf's clothing, as it were. And there's Mullerian mimicry, where all the ones that say taste bad look alike to make up for slow learners amongst the predators. To my knowledge, we don't have much of this kind of protective mimicry in the computer field, at least yet. We have the reverse. Honeypots do try to look tasty and vulnerable when they are not. As such, honeypots are more like anglerfish. And as with everything else today, we may have something to learn from nature. Perhaps every network segment needs a honeypot, a model that the common field cricket uses, when the male who is singing is targeted by predators, but that male will be surrounded by other males who do not sing, only mate. Maybe the answer is just coexistence, which OASIS in the US or MAFTA in Europe call intrusion tolerance. It isn't as if there is any new news in saying that by now we simply shouldn't have buffer overflows in applications, yet of course we still do. Perhaps the answer is to just learn to tolerate those overflows and the intrusions they tend to enable. Medical science hasn't solved the common cold either. We've just learned to tolerate it after effectively giving up on immunization as a public health strategy. There are 350,000 species of beetles, which led the biologist Haldane to say that the creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for them. This degree of speciation means beetles have an authentication problem. That is to say, with whom can I mate? We do authentication using cryptographic keys and locks, and keys and locks are not interchangeable. Beetles have the analog equivalent. The mechanics of the male's penis will only match the mechanics of a female of the same species, enough so that properly curated specimens in museum collections will exhibit the penis adjacent to but detached from the rest of the specimen. One can stretch and say that the various mating dances of beetles and other higher forms are just so much pre-authentication. While some people like to say that specialization is for insects, tell me that the security field itself is not busily specializing. We have people who are expert in forensics on specific operating system localizations, expert in setting up intrusion response, expert in analyzing large sets of firewall rules using non-trivial set theory, expert in designing egress filters for universities that have no ingress filters like MIT next door, expert in steganographically watermarking binaries, and so forth. Generalists are becoming rare, and they're being replaced by specialists. This is speciation in action and the narrowing of niches. In rough numbers, there are somewhere close to 5,000 various technical certifications that you can get in the computer field, and the number of them is growing, thus proving the conjecture of specialization and speciation is not just for insects, and it will not stop. Lest you think that it's too far-fetched to consider a computer a life form subject to evolution just like any other life form, consider embedded systems. They're already 2 orders of magnitude more numerous than keyboards and displays, hence the future with threat space, which we must lead the same way the hunter leads the deer while hunting, is this threat space where a computer is not identifiable as such, but is instead inside some nondescript appliance. So should or should not an embedded system have a remote management interface? If it does not, then a late discovered flaw cannot be fixed without visiting all those embedded systems, which is likely to be infeasible, both because some will be where you cannot go and there will be too many of them anyway. If it does have a remote management interface, the opponent of skill focuses on that, and once a break is achieved, will use those self-same management functions to ensure that not only does he retain control over the long interval, but as well you will be unlikely to know that he is there. This leads to a proposal on what to do about the future. Embedded systems, if having no remote management interface and thus out of reach, are a life form. And as the purpose of life is to end, an embedded system without a remote management interface must be so designed as to be certain to die no later than some fixed date. Conversely, an embedded system that does have a remote management interface must be sufficiently self-protecting that it is capable of refusing a command. A lot of people say that complexity is the enemy of security, and I'm one of them. But at the same time, I'm here to argue that we have to learn from nature precisely because nature is the most complex thing we will ever see. Nature is an existence proof that complexity is not the enemy of life, but complexity is the enemy of stasis. Our problem is that we've pretty much equated security with stasis, and it is slowly getting us into trouble. Take forest fires. If you always quench them, such as to protect vacation homes and tourist dollars, then you necessarily build up the supply of unburned fuel wood in the ecosystem, and someday you will get a much bigger fire. If you let any and every fire burn, someone who can vote will lose. If you prevent any and every fire, you look smart, life goes on, predictably so, at least until it doesn't. Part of our inability to cope with complexity is that we're treating security as an end when it is not. Maybe we can get to a game we can win by changing the rules such that it is not security that is the goal state, but perhaps, say, reliability. Which leads me to recall Leslie Lamport's bon mot, a distributed system is one on which I cannot get any work done because some machine I have never heard of has crashed. I'll go one step further. Security for a mature industry is almost surely a subset of reliability, and that an insecure system won't be reliable, but that just being secure doesn't assure reliability. As most of you know, availability is formally measured as mean time between failures divided by the sum of mean time between failures plus mean time to repair. As such, there are two games you can play to get 100% availability. In one game, you do everything you can to force mean time between failures to infinity. In the other game, you do everything you can to force mean time to repair to zero. Infinite time between failures or zero time to recover both yield 100% availability. The former, infinite MTBF, is a fine goal in and of itself, but at this point in history, we have put so many security products into our systems that the complexity of the sum of those security products has become itself part of the problem. If we look at nature in the form of the equations of ecology, we see two alternative games for survival as well, R selection and K selection. R-selected species produce many offspring, each of whom has a relatively low probability of surviving to adulthood. By contrast, K-selected species are strong competitors in crowded niches and invest more heavily in much fewer offspring, each of whom has a relatively high probability of reaching adulthood. If we change the term produce many offspring to re-image frequently, you now have precisely the advice that Microsoft's Dan Seglio gave when he said, in dealing with rootkits and advanced spyware programs, the only solution is to rebuild from scratch. In some cases, there's really no way to recover without nuking the systems from orbit. This brilliant remark is a direct, if inadvertent, suggestion that desktop machines tend to be R-selected. They need to die and be reborn often. If you are of a mind to invest in virtual machines, you may get R-selection as a side effect to whatever it is you're trying to do with VMs. My bacteriologist mentor taught me a further thing. The higher up the evolutionary ladder you go, the greater the percentage of the organism's total metabolic investment goes to self-protection, topping out with humankind's investment of 20 years to raise its children. Her thought, and now mine, is that since it is abundantly obvious that except for the people in this room, there are a few computer users who are doubling their work output every 18 months, hence the dividend of Moore's law should be spent in increasing fractions on protecting the computer and the data it holds. My own company's product effectively suggests that you spend some of the 45,000x dividend that Moore's law has provided since the 1983 publication of the Orange Book on implementing the reference monitor, to take the example closest to my home. If we do somehow decide to do the kind of security metrics that are available to us at this early stage, they are likely to be trend metrics, since as a point of practice, a poor quality metric will still give useful trend data absent pathologic details that for the purpose of this talk I will ignore. Trend data, however, will never predict the black swan, the equilibrium punctuator, and so we have to mix our day-to-day efforts at prevention, which is to say lengthening mean time between failure, with preparation for fast recovery when all of our efforts at prevention are shown to have been a fool's errand, which is to say shortening the mean time to repair. Both in your consideration of security and in your consideration of God, remember that one cannot estimate the infinite with finite evidence. I trace the security industry as we know it today to one of those black swan events, but one in comparative slow motion compared to, say, the witty worm. Specifically, I trace the birth of the industry in which all of us here earn our paycheck to Microsoft's introduction of a TCP/IP stack as a freebie on the Windows platform. Besides putting FTP software out of business, a tactic followed so many times that I've literally lost count, the TCP/IP stack took an OS designed for a single owner-operator on a private net, if any net, and connected it to the world. Once that stack was installed, every sociopath was your next-door neighbor. And as such, we can point to that event as the birth of our industry. Had I chosen to do visual aids today, I would show you the sudden, one-time only, dramatic spike in the second derivative of the rate of attacks reported to the CERT that immediately followed the appearance of the TCP/IP stack on Windows. Note that I said a spike in the second derivative. Nothing much else happened for a while. But similarly, lighting the solid fuel on the space shuttle doesn't have any instantaneously visible effect either. The second of these moments occurred, as far as I can tell, about 24 months ago. Like the first, it was not a thunderbolt, more like a glacier finishing its slide across a riverbed and thus finally damming the waters. That moment was when our principal opponents changed over from adventurers and braggarts to professionals. In a sense, professionalization of the attack class is akin to virulence, in that the increasing immunity of computer systems forced it an upgrade in the ability of the attacker to attack, i.e. finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them is now hard enough that it has moved out of the realm of being a hobby and into the realm of being a job. This changes several things, notably that hobbyists share their findings and are paid in bragging rights, whereas professionals do not share and are paid in something more substantial. Speaking biologically, a mutation towards strength on the part of the prey was matched by a mutation also towards strength on the part of the predator. As a side effect, the percentage of all vulnerabilities that are unknown has risen and will continue to rise. We have yet to reach the post-punctuation equilibrium in this case. This mutation towards strength represented by professionalization of the attack class was not a simple compensating match for increasing self-protection in the merchant operating systems. It went further, and it did so because, at least for the first world, the digital arena is now clearly where the opportunities are, such that when robbing banks, it is the amateur who uses a handgun and the professional who uses a bot. In the fall of 2006, I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations that resulted in a guess that 15 to 30% of all desktops had some degree of external control present. I got hate mail over that, but in the intervening months, VentSurf said 20 to 40, Microsoft guessed 2/3, IDG guessed 3/4. It doesn't matter who's right. What matters is that this changes a core feature of the ecosystem, and changing a core feature is the very definition of a punctuating event. In this case, it actually was not standing up a professional class of attackers anymore than the first go-round. It was a spike in the second derivative of a reported attack rate. What it was, that a fundamental assumption of network security has been breached, and there's no putting it back together again. Ever since we did Kerberos, the idea that I'm okay and you're okay, but the big bad network in between us cannot be trusted for a second, authentication, authorization, and accountability, all of which began with authentication, have been essential. And in turn, the authentication begins by asking the operating system the name of the user. What has really changed, it is not true that I'm okay and you're okay, since it is entirely likely that the counterparty to whom you are connecting is already compromised. A secure network connection, who cares if the other end is hosed? Spafford was right, but way early when he likened network security as hiring an armored car to deliver gold bars from someone living in a cardboard box to someone living on a park bench. This is the new security situation that we're facing. What to do about owned counterparties? This is a today issue, not a tomorrow issue. The November 2006 10Q filing for E-Trade included a material loss due exactly to this problem, the first SEC filing of this sort to my knowledge. Owned machines mean keyloggers, and keyloggers mean opponents can get you to help them in the pump phase of a pump and dump stock fraud, whether you like to or not. If and when you ever bother to call your discount broker to complain that this or that purchase was not the one you did, the broker has two choices. They can tell you you're an idiot, or they can tell you we'll make it up to you. Such a situation is untenable. The most likely option, and it is under discussion in several places today, is for some kinds of transactions to be based on the merchant side owning the customer side for the duration of the transaction. Whether this comes as an ActiveX control, some sort of use-once browser, or what else remains to be seen. In clinical trials, pharmaceutical companies have long ago found it was safer and easier to manage if they just shipped a laptop to the particular doctor. Brokerages probably won't do that, and random e-commerce merchants absolutely will not. So we are back to whether it is a good idea for the merchant side of the transaction to assume that the client side is already compromised and to compromise it further for a moment on its own account. This is not an easy decision to make for either side, but if the average customer's choice is a no-loss guarantee in exchange for a moment of remote control, then it's my bet that they will take the offer. Whether this is how it goes or not is, however, irrelevant. I'm just using this as an example of an adaptive reaction to your opponents becoming good enough that the original "I'm okay, you're okay" starting point for network security no longer applies, and something will have to replace it. By the way, if you think the professionals aren't winning, just consider that they now value stealth over persistence, i.e., they find it so easy to own machines that they make no effort to survive reboot, preferring instead to hide in core only. Consider this the equivalent of gene therapy as prescribed by Dr. Faustus. At the end of the day, however, we are facing a much bigger, more metaphysical question than the ones I have so far posed. That I can pose others is of no consequence. Either you're sick of them by now or you're scribbling down your own as I speak. The bigger question is this: how much security do we want? How much security do we want is the real question. And while nature can give us more clues than we can ever use in improving what we puny humans can do, we are fast closing on a point where the question we must ask is whether we wish to turn over the security, our security, to sentient machines. Kurzweil, in The Singularity is Near, is beyond all doubt correct. Within the career lifetime of nearly everyone in this room, computers will be smarter than we are. Once people in this room, only you, will understand that what I'm now going to say is this: security is perhaps the most difficult intellectual profession on the planet. The core knowledge base has reached the point where new recruits can no longer hope to be competent generalists. Serial specialization is the only broad option available to them. Computers will soon be called upon to do what we cannot, and that is to protect us from other computers, and to ask no permission in so doing. Every practitioner in this room can tell some story where an insane affection for convenience caused people for whom you were nominally responsible to create or at least tolerate insecurity, and to be offended if you endeavored to make them see that light. That they outnumber us, and they will demand protection with convenience. They see no problem in surveillance if it keeps them safe. They, and especially the younger of them, have never considered whether they had or did not have privacy, and thus do not and will not miss what they never had. Being eternally online and available has reached the point where one is thought exceeding odd to be otherwise, when, in point of fact, the most heated debate at the first workshop on mobile computing, held a mile from here just 15 years ago, was on precisely the offense that an expectation of being always online represented. The percentage of corporate assets that are digital rather than physical is growing, and deploying protection against threats to those assets will make the Sony rootkit or DRM seem quaintly innocent by comparison. The next punctuation of the equilibrium, in my prediction, will be the effective end of the general-purpose computer as a consumer durable, as presaged already by Apple dropping the word computer from its name, or leading Wall Street trading firms already going back to displays only on the desktop with no PCs at all. If you do not have a general-purpose computer, which, to paraphrase Ed Felton, you have the freedom to tinker, I ask you, what kind of security will that be? I will tell you what kind it is, but first I will say that what brought us all here to this field of endeavor is a love of knowing how things work, and by satisfying that love by knowing how they fail. We, all of us here, hunt the unknown unknowns. The smartest thing a U.S. Cabinet Secretary has said in my lifetime was Rumsfeld's remarks on how it was the unknown unknowns that interest him. Every person who made fun of that remark, if nothing else, proved that they were innumerate. The unknown unknowns are why we are here. The unknown unknowns are a predictor of various kinds of failure. The urge to stamp them out is understandable, but God help us if we take the bargain that promises no more unknown unknowns. Kurzweil's singularity includes the idea that all knowledge will be available to everyone at all times. And because this is one hell of a lot of knowledge, you will be only too grateful to have your memory uploaded from your brain to your real, personal digital assistant. A world without failure is a world without freedom. A world without the possibility of sin is a world without the possibility of righteousness. A world without the possibility of crime is a world where you cannot prove you're not a criminal. A technology that can give you everything you want is a technology that can take away everything you have. At some point, and real soon now, some of us security geeks will have to say that safety is not safe. I know full well that my views on this are neither pleasant nor fashionable, but I'm staring into the fog of the future as hard as I can. There's never enough time. Thank you for yours.
Thank you, Dan. It's been an honor to have you, and thank you just so much for your support. Do you want to do a question, or do you want to?
What do you want? What's your time? Do you want?
How are we doing for time? Time? 48 minutes past.
And you wanted 50. So there you are.
50,
I
so
think
there
it's
we
time
are.
for a break. We can talk at the break without our friend the microphone.
Yes. Thanks.